I'm Dr. Lisa Nicoletti, Professor of Art History and Visual Studies at Centenary, and I'm here with a group of Centenary student scholars studying the Holocaust and Dr. Lower's book. Before we begin, Centenary students on the webinar, you can earn passport points later for attending this lecture. To expand your cultural awareness and horizons, though you may have to remind me to share the QR code at the very end. I might be distracted from listening to this fascinating talk. The Thyn Lecture was initiated by Sheldon and Rochelle Goldschall in 2009 to honor local beloved Holocaust survivors Rose and Louis Thyn, and to address the subject of oppression caused by anti-Semitism, racism, and bigotry. The generosity and vision of these community members who adored Rose and Louis ensured the lecture series would commemorate the Holocaust on Centenary's campus annually. Centenary is so very grateful to the nearly 100 donors who contributed to the Thyn Lecture series. To learn more about Rose and Louis' amazing lives and legacies, please note son Nico Thyn's interesting book on your screen, available at bookshops online, and a special welcome to the Thyn family. I also want to take a moment to announce that Shreveport-Bossier's 39th annual Holocaust Remembrance Service will take place Sunday, May 1st at 3 p.m. at Broadmoor United Methodist Church and will be live streamed online. To find out more, please visit holocaustremembranceservice.org. I wish we didn't need annual Holocaust lectures and remembrance services, but we do. Perhaps more than ever, intolerance, apathy, hate crimes, anti-Semitism, and racism are also dangerous current pandemics in the United States. A bit more than 2 weeks ago, worshipers at a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, were taken hostage, and yesterday, historically Black colleges and universities received bomb threats, a terrorizing start to Black History Month. We must learn, we must teach, we must investigate, we must support each other, and take bold and active stands against hate mongering. Unfortunately, just repeating never again will never be sufficient. Tonight's speaker will graphically reveal the consequences of hate through one horrible photograph and share her decade-long investigation that has immortalized 3 Holocaust victims. If you have a question at any time during the talk tonight, there is a Q&A button down below where you may enter your questions, and you may upvote questions that most interest you. We hope to get some of these questions, at the end, if our student panelists' questions haven't already answered them. And now, or asked them, I should say. And now, about our distinguished guest, Dr. Lower is a John K. Roth Professor of History and Director of the Mgrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College in California. Her research and teaching focus on the history of Germany and Ukraine in World War II, the Holocaust, women's history, human rights, and genocide studies. She is a National Book Award and National Jewish Book Award finalist for her work, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, and previously served as the acting director of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Lower, a very warm welcome. If you're able, please go ahead and share your PowerPoint and introduce us to your work.
Wonderful. I don't know if people can see me. I have my video on, but I don't know.
We can.
Oh, you can. Oh, okay. I didn't see. I don't have that view. Okay, good. Oh, good. All right, there you are. Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Nicoletti, for all the preparations and organizational communications. It's always the reality is that these programs don't just happen. A lot of people are behind them, and I want to thank you and your colleagues and students, and also acknowledge the Van Thyn family and that beautiful photograph that you had of that couple, of the parents. Was really, really touching. And I agree with you. I wish that we didn't even have to do this, but at some level too, I'm glad we do it, because it's an opportunity to learn too, and share research and educate when we do these memorial events. And thank you for sharing that latest information about the HBCUs. I was not aware of those threats. So yes, we do live in a dangerous world. So this evening, I'm going to present on my latest book, The Ravine. I was just excited. About a week ago, I found out, and it's official, that it won the National Jewish Book Award in the category of the Holocaust. So that was the latest recognition of it, to my delight and surprise. But the story, really, I wrote it for a couple of different audiences when I embarked on this. And I was inspired by my students and by the fact that in my teaching, I used a lot of imagery, and in my publishing too, and realized over the years that I was not really dealing with those images in an appropriate manner, some kind of sensitive manner. They were up on the screen, and I did my best to contextualize them as an historian, but a lot of issues and questions came up when I was using them about especially images of atrocities or of the victims, and many of those images that we have of the victims are primarily of them being led to their death, or in mass graves and liberation photos, which are prominently displayed in places like the Holocaust, where I consider kind of my second professional home. And we've all seen how one photograph of suffering or violence can move audiences and propel humanitarian action and social justice. Iconic images of atrocities, of other atrocities besides the Holocaust, like that naked girl fleeing the napalm attack in Vietnam, or recently that little Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi, whose corpse washed up on that Turkish beach, and that changed Angela Merkel and European position on the Syrian refugee crisis, for instance. And then we have all these iconic images from the Holocaust, and I'm going to now share my screen. Hold on, and pull these up, and also forewarn you that some of them are disturbing, and the subject of our talk today is a very graphic image. Can you see that? Okay, I see people nodding. All right, great. Okay, so these are some of the images that you may find kind of familiar. Sorry. Pardon me. For those of you who do these presentations or teach with Zoom, you will appreciate the fact that the little bar that is a kind of instructional bar blocks your actual screen. It's hard to present when there's this bar. Okay, that's better. So these images here may be familiar to Anne Frank, of course, and the gates leading to Birkenau. This one on the left underneath that, it's called The Last Jew in Vinnitsa from Ukraine, the little boy from the Warsaw Ghetto with his arms raised. And then these other images of murder from the so-called Holocaust by bullets, also Ukraine. And then this liberation photo from Bergen-Belsen. So they're often used as kind of stock standard illustrations, but not studied as historical documents. And I knew that these graphic images were the subject of scholarly debates about what should or should not be displayed. Susan Sontag, Susan Crane, and others who discuss these matters, but not really any rules about what should or should not be studied, or how it should be researched, and what were the ethics and methods of that inquiry. So I had written books on Nazi empire building, for instance, that really privileged German documents and Nazi documentation, and then another book about a victim's diary. But I wondered about visual evidence, especially in communities where there's just really little left. There's so few traces on paper. When you find a photograph like the one I'm going to show you, and you realize that may very well be all we have from that entire community, what do you do with that single photograph? Will it open up new lines of inquiry and discovery, and what kinds of approaches can you take? So the story for me began with this image in 2009. And feel free to put any of your kind of reactions to this and questions in the chat, because clearly a powerful image that evokes all kinds of feelings and questions and assumptions too. And I had my own assumptions when I saw it in 2009. Two journalists had brought the image from Prague. It had been locked in the archives since the 1950s. Okay, so here's this very incriminating picture, close-up image of collaboration of murder happening. And it was not used in any post-war pursuit of justice against those killers there in the image, right? So it's seeing the light of day now in 2009, and these journalists wanted to know more about it, and they shared what they had, which was the testimony of the photographer, which was rare to have the story of the photographer as a witness describing what he saw, and even down to the details of the camera that he used that day to take this picture. And the date was provided and the location. So I had October 13th, 1941, and the location is Mariupol, Ukraine, which is about 100 miles west of Kiev. And we're going to look a little bit at that shtetl, that former shtetl, in a moment. But what's striking about this image? First of all, looking back at all the years of research and memorialization on this topic, those shoes in the foreground, I mean, the entire image has a certain composition, a kind of evidentiary as far as the crime being documented, but also the photographer, and we're taking on his position here, his gaze. This is a stable image, and it's in threes, as rule of thirds, and we have the family right at the center, the way he's cropped it, and then those shoes at the bottom, and they're just so reminiscent of the way that we think about the victims in these museums, the shoes that are on display at Birkenau and at the museum in Washington, D.C., and the idea of the absence of presence and the presence of absence. Someone wore those shoes. They look like a man had just taken them off. And there's some papers around there. And because we have the advent of digital technology, we can zoom in and zoom out on these images easily. And indeed, around those boots are bullet casings, a kind of litter of mass murder. And this is raising questions about other victims that may have been shot right before that family at the center. Was it a father? Was it a brother? Can we identify that person? Are those papers there on the floor? Maybe those are actual lists of names. And then up in the corner here to the left, the reality that the sunlight is coming in here. It's mid-morning. It's passing through the trees, and then this pit, which kind of looks like a ravine, but it's clearly, it's the mass grave. It's where the victims are going to be forced to fall into that, off the precipice of the end of that shooting site. And this raises questions about the Holocaust by bullets as it occurred outside the camp system in these open air mass shootings. First of all, in places like Ukraine, we have more than 1 million victims, as many as possibly 1.5 million, who were not, the vast majority were not brought to the gassing centers. Only in one region of Ukraine were they sent from Galicia. But the rest of Ukraine, including this town, they were the victims. The perpetrators went to the victims. They went to their towns. They forced them to the edge of town. There were rapid operations. Names were not taken down. Families were not registered by the Germans. And they brought them to these locations proximate to local communities and parks where everything could be heard. The screams and the sounds and the gunfire, and then here in their landscape, this is someone's hometown. These are the Jews' hometown. These are the Ukrainians who are in the picture. It's their hometown, and someone's been forced to dig this pit, and now the hometown has this mass grave in it. And there's a geological kind of environmental history piece of this, because the 100 to 200 Jews who were killed on that day of that massacre were forced into that pit, buried in that pit. The soil then was placed over them, and all of that reality, forensic reality of the decomposition of the victims, and this is their final resting place, is changing the landscape and changing the topography of that very place. And the Germans put nature to work. I mean, they used mass graves to suffocate the victims. And then later on, they went back and disinterred them and tried to cremate them and hide the traces. So this is also part of their kind of machinery of destruction. And people tend not to appreciate the systematic, thorough nature of this because it's happening kind of outside and not in the killing factories that we think of, that modern kind of mechanized killing. And then to the right, these killers. I mean, when I first saw this, I thought I was really surprised to see the Ukrainians shooting. And you can see the expression on the face of the one Ukrainian's kind of grimacing and pulling back and pulling on the trigger, shoulder to shoulder with these German officials. You can see their caps, their Nazi uniforms, and there's an onlooker there with that beret, another witness. And they don't speak the same language. These Germans have just come in as occupation forces in the summer of 1941. And these Ukrainian auxiliaries have been recruited on the spot. And they're sharing in this kind of anti-Semitic hate, in carrying out the murder of Jews in that community. The photographer, when he was questioned about this, said that the Ukrainian policemen were calling out the names of some of the Jewish victims. So they were from that town and they knew some of these victims. And the smoke that is hovering there is another clue when you talk to ballistics experts, and this is all of interdisciplinary program. I mean, to try to do this research and try to explain what happened and how it happened and its aftermath, as you can see, has required a lot of different types of approaches outside the archive. So the book is really also for students to think about, and scholars and researchers to think about all the different ways we can piece this history together as an historical event. And so ballistics expert told me that the muzzle blast here of the guns is piercing this smoke that was left hovering from prior victims. And this is an execution style shooting. And so, that could have been the man here in the coat or others. And that's creating that, piercing that, creating that kind of a halo, that kind of a ring there above the woman's head. This family in the center of the image, the woman kneeling over in the Mary Jane shoes and the polka dotted dress, and the color that's popping out there, and the little boy, barefooted boy, and he's kind of slipping into the pit, and it's quite it's probable that he was not shot because the Germans didn't want to waste bullets on the children. And then with again a closer look here, we can see another soul. We can see a child kind of slipping off her lap here, and there's their leg and her little behind there. So, this looking again and piecing it, pulling apart the image to try to find more clues, results in these kinds of discoveries, including the discovery of another victim, of another soul, another life. This is the testimony that the photographer gave in 1958. He was interrogated because it was such an incriminating photo, and he had a series of photos actually. And it turns out, as I studied, this is the material culture part of this, his camera, he describes his Zeiss Icon camera down here. This is in Slovakian. This is international research and requires a lot of languages. And I had to call on even survivors from Slovakia. Were at the museum when I was working there. They were helping me translate this. And so it was just, really the experience of doing this work and all the people who get involved, that kind of community of researchers is really something I appreciate. It's tough work, but when you have a team together to work on it, it's easier. So here he tells us about the camera, and it turns out that camera, which didn't have a zoom lens, so then we can say, he's about 20 feet from the crime scene of the point where he's pointing a camera. And the film can hold about 8 images, the film that he used that day. And so we were on the search for the additional images, and we 7 to 8 images, and we found 5 out of the series that he took. And this is one of the other ones, and I'm sorry, it's also very disturbing. This woman alone being shot, but it's the same scene. You can see the shoes there and the kind of paper or cloths, and then there's that coat again. Those 2 same Ukrainians in those Red Army coats with armbands. And then you get a better image, front image of that German. And this was really important because I could then see the markings on his uniform and determine, in fact, that that's not the buckle of SS. That's not a Wehrmacht, an army jacket. That's not an army insignia. It's not the order police. This is all part of trying to find the German files on the perpetrators. Those are finance guards. Those are customs officials. So they really had no business there. They weren't trained to shoot civilians in this way. They're not part of Himmler's agencies at all. They're part of the finance ministry. And so they volunteered. They were the only Germans stationed in the town. And they literally got up and said, "Jawohl, I'm going to do this." These guys were in this unit and thought this was something they wanted to experience in the war, and bragged about it actually to their comrades when they returned back to their barracks. Here's our photographer and his camera. This was taken a little bit after the war, actually about the time that interrogation occurred in the 50s. Lubomir, born in 1916, and that Zeiss icon, which is now in a museum in Bratislava. He donated the camera to a museum in 2005 before he died, with the expressed wish to actually have it on display and have his photographs on display, but that has yet to happen. And one of the big surprises in the book is the photographer, because when I looked at that, I thought he must be a part of the collaborating forces. He's in uniform. Anyone who took a picture at such close range is so denigrating to the victims. This is not how they wanted to be portrayed. They're being murdered as a family, and he's got his camera out. And this is what Susan Sontag's talking about. Put your camera down. What happens at that moment, and the victims, if they even noticed that someone was taking their pictures, in addition to all the horrors that they had to experience up to that point. So here we have him with his camera, and it turns out that was his turning point. That was his enough moment. He took those pictures and went back to Bratislava for the Christmas holiday, and then he pretended to be ill, and he and his wife engaged in a whole resistance program with hiding Jews in their attic and showing them these photographs to warn them not to go east. This is what's going to happen to you. And he was a technician and a radio operator in the resistance, and was recognized for that after the war. He's not a righteous Gentile. I wrote to Yad Vashem and tried to get that application going, but he's yet to be kind of formally recognized by Yad Vashem. This is a picture of him in September 41, just a few weeks before he took that picture, before that massacre. And he's writing back to his wife about this time, in October 41, the letters that the family shared with me about how his hair is turning gray prematurely. He's like 25 years old. He's completely anti-war, and his mind is turning black. And he and his comrades are starting to drink more moonshine, and just this experience is really is a kind of form of brutalization, as it were, of the war, and his experience, and haunted him for the rest of his life. This is the era of the camera craze. So the visual culture that is part of, why does this Slovakian have this camera? What was possible time with photography? And in the 20s and 30s, the Leica, this icon, and the camera companies, this craze and a surge of consumption of the pocket camera. By 1939, 10% of the German population owned cameras, and Goebbels was embedding these journalists, 15,000 of them in the war, producing millions of images. So we have this incredible archive. It's one of the most well documented, visually, genocides, and certainly the war on record. But they weren't supposed to be taking pictures of, like the one we were just looking at, of Jewish civilians being murdered. And as soon as the campaign started in the summer of 41, the killing part of the campaign with Operation Barbarossa, Himmler had to start issuing orders to not take pictures and to ban that and to confiscate them, and to try to control that. And he reissued that order several times, because in fact, these photos were a source of resistance, and my photographer was using his photograph to warn the Jews. And this is what the Nazis were suspecting. But it is part of this culture. Here's the film company. Photos are a bridge between the home front and the battlefront, and ordinary German soldiers and the Axis soldiers who have cameras are thinking that they're embarking on this monumental campaign that they want to document and they want to share these stories with their loved ones back home. Mariupol was not well known to me the first time I went to Ukraine in '92 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I just drove right through there, and it's just, but this is just shtetl, but this is a 16th, 15th century map, and actually here it is at the center. Here is a map of Ukraine, what is going to be the Pale of Settlement, the Russian Pale of Settlement, a kind of reservation where Jews are concentrated, but a whole civilization of Jewish life that was beautifully portrayed by Ansky, a famous ethnographer before the war, who went to Mariupol and started to collect, like Vishniak, like collect stories and take photographs of the kind of vanishing shtetl. And when he was in Mariupol, Ansky was hearing about the stories, the Dybbuk, this kind of story of that the Orthodox Jewish community there was relating and even performing. And now it's a famous Yiddish play that is performed, and it was a movie in the 1930s, but it's based on the community in Mariupol. And there's more about that in the book, and I think that's important to stress the kind of life before, what was lost. And here we see how loss, what it looks like in the market square there decades later in the aftermath of genocide. This is Mariupol in 2014, a monument to the Second World War. It's a kind of generic monument. There's no mention here of the Holocaust or of Jews specifically, but this is the Great Patriotic War. This is a champagne bottle. And this used to be a thriving marketplace, market town with a Polish lord up on the hill at his estate. And these empty spaces here were Jewish homes and Jewish businesses. And so that's, this is a kind of gutted civilization here. And this is also because of Ukraine's history in the 20th century, the First World War, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Holodomor, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now the country is threatened with, is at war with Russia and is facing an expansion of that and more violence. It's been a very difficult century, to say the least, for Ukraine. The path that those victims were forced to walk extended from the marketplace the night before they were gathered and subjected to pogrom-like abuses and violations of women and theft, and kept up all night and exhausted and frightened, not knowing what was going to happen because their community was isolated. And they were then forced to march in this direction opposite the bicyclist here. And you'll see here past this police station, they were forced to remain in the station. The Ukrainians were circling this station, taunting them and singing the funeral march. And then they were marched. Here's a drawing that the Soviets did in their investigation of what happened there on that day. And here's the arrow that this is a drawing that was made in conjunction with the investigation that started in 1985, really late. This is the era of glasnost, perestroika, and Gorbachev, and the local prosecutors are encouraged to give it another round, to go now 40 years later and search for any remaining suspects. And this prosecutor found those Ukrainian policemen, which is incredible. And they were forced to reenact what happened. This is 86, and they were put on trial. And this is why we have this very detailed sketch. Remember, they don't have the photo. The photo is in the Prague archive, but their investigation, the witness testimony, really matches the photograph. And so that it was impressive what they were able to pull together. And here's the arrest documentation on that one of the policemen. You can see, and we can match his face when we look at the other picture. So these are the documents from the Soviet archives. They were executed in January 87, which is interesting because Ukraine got its independence in 91. So this is really kind of late before Ukrainian independence. And I was there in 92. One of the defendants got 15 years in a Russian jail, and I don't know what happened to him, if he ever came back to Mariupol. The German investigation was very perfunctory, and this is this kind of template document that they used in West Germany in 1969 is an illustration of a policeman on duty one night at a small station in Lautzen near Hanover, who just kind of put this form in and said, oh, somebody wanted to report a crime. This is someone who was a member of that finance guard unit and went in there and was denouncing his former comrade. He had a kind of personal vendetta, but he also provided this very basic information to this police chief at this station. And that, it occurred in 41, it occurred in Mariupol, that Jewish and Russian people were the victims, but he didn't know who they were. And then he goes on to describe what happened that day from the German side. Comparing the photograph to the German documents yields a lot of discoveries as well, because there's a lot of lying, a lot of perjuring going on, and their account doesn't quite match up to the photo as far as they said they weren't there. They said they didn't do any shooting, that kind of thing. So the search for the family was really what I was focused on in this book, and the surprise there. I mean, I assumed that I could find them because of the work at the museums in the Yad Vashem, for instance, and pages of testimony and Jewish genealogical sites. And it turns out that I couldn't identify them with 100% certainty. I went through about, all we had was half the number of the victims listed, that the Russians, this is a Russian list that was put together very quickly at the end of the war. And we have surnames, family names, and birth dates. So we can see family clusters here. And I thought that little boy might be born in 1935. It was hard to see the woman, and eventually narrowed it down to a family unit that was killed in the park in October 41. And when I got to the page of testimony on that family, here's the testimony page for Yad Vashem, there was this photo attached to it. And this is really rare, that a photograph, and this is a wartime photograph, it's from 1941, it was taken in Mariupol. It's how these women and children, what was left of the Vasylyuk family, and it's a Jewish family with some intermarriage with Ukrainians, how they wanted to be portrayed at the end. But the likeness is striking. That this would be the woman bending over, Hiva. She was a nurse. She was taking care of her elderly mother, who's not pictured here. Her elderly mother was infirm, was disabled, and was shot in her bed when the Ukrainians and Germans came in. But then these other two children could possibly, that could be the little boy, and that could be the other child that's on her lap. And this was her child. And these are her sister-in-laws. And yeah, this is the way they want to be portrayed. The family theme in the book, I wanted to point out, was important, I think, for a couple of reasons, or for many reasons, actually. I'll just touch on a few. Stressing the experience of genocide from the perspective of the family unit, instead of from 6 million and one name being read. What is the experience of the Jewish family who has to make some of these horrible decisions about who's going to hide, who's going to emigrate, and then experiencing the murder together. And that the genociders the Nazis that was deliberate as part of that additional torture and horror that they inflicted on them. And this also happens, of course, in other genocides, but wanted to bring out that experience from the victims. How much the Nazis and how much genociders who take on a biological racial view of root and branch killing focus on the family. And Hitler had said in the summer of 41, no Jewish family should be left on the continent of Europe, because the offspring and the relatives will come back and avenge the murder of their loved ones, and it won't be a final solution. So for him, and the Nazis, of course, were obsessed with race and genealogy and lineage, and so this was I think at the forefront of their thinking as killers too. And showing this picture to Ukrainians in Mariupol today with Father Dubois' team, when I went back with Yohad and Unam, and getting more information about who these people were. Again, these are just the traces we have. There's no, for this particular community, there's half of a written list of the victims. There's this photo that I found, there's the photos that we've been looking at, and there's one testimony from Ludmila Bleckman, the only survivor, an audiovisual testimony. So any names and any bits of information that could be gleaned from these local witnesses, maybe a former classmate or anything, an occupation of that person, for me was valuable. And we did get a lot of information from the 18 witnesses we identified. We follow the path of the sketch that I showed you to go to the actual crime scene. And here we are walking towards that site with Johan and Unim's team. And we're really shocked when we got there in July 2016, because there were still, first of all, the landscape was a kind of moonscape. It was craters and, sunken in and haloing earth and just disfigured in a way of the way that soil, settles. It was just not natural erosion. And that was clear. We were just standing there and trying to figure out what happened there. And then we reached down and we discovered these bones, the vertebrae, we just moved the earth and these skull fragments, because the Soviet investigators really went in there pretty brutally in their exhumation with trucks and shovels, and that disrupted the victims' remains. I mean, it was like another assault on this community as far as their right to have a proper burial and to be at peace. I just want to wrap up now and kind of decompress a little bit and think a little bit with you about this, where I started with these shoes here in the foreground, and the meaning of that in the way that we study this history and think about it, and the fact that the empty shoes and the crumpled coat exists there as questions and gaps in our knowledge. And they remind us of the victims whom we cannot see and the many who were murdered and remain missing. When I was researching this, a colleague of mine, we were discussing this, the shoes and the absence of presence and this concept and this idea. And she was a literature specialist, Sarah Horowitz, and she said, you should really look at of the book. And I just wanted to read a couple of stanzas from it because it is very evocative. And I think it's in these Memorial Days, I think it's a nice way to kind of close out our program, my presentation. Prior to and during the Holocaust, empty shoes figured in abstract art, literature, and photography as symbols of, and the use of shoes to depict loss is not only a post-war curatorial technique of Holocaust museums. As historical sources of material culture, shoes have come to aestheticize absence and mourning on a large scale. These stanzas from the Yiddish poet Abraham Sutzkever, the poem is called A Load of Shoes, written upon the discovery of his deported mother's shoes in the Vilna ghetto, capture this sense. Now I'm going to read them. The feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride? Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps. Look, there are my mother's, her Sabbath pair in with the others. Abraham Sutzkever wrote this poem on January 1st, 1943. In Sutzkever's poem, empty boots, slippers, and pumps exist somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, maidens, and brides at a wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance and patter. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers, unlike those haunting but inert objects that we see today enshrined behind glass in the Birkenau or bronzed as memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. Like flawed testimonies and memories, photographs can mislead because they can never completely capture the reality of the event pictured or those involved. The Jewish man who was murdered, perhaps with his family's not there, although his empty shoes and crumpled coat remain. We cannot see beyond the frame of the image. We can't turn 360 degrees to take in the entire setting of the victims waiting to be killed, other possible onlookers, including our Slovakian photographer and his comrades, and more German officials. The papers strewn amid the bullet casings at the edge of the mass grave could be German lists or Jewish identity documents. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. LA, would you like to start off a round of questioning?
Yes, thank you so much for coming and talking with us. The first question that I had is two misconceptions your book like immediately addresses is like the amount of atrocity images that are available to us and the magnitude of the Holocaust in Ukraine. Could you kind of summarize some of what you talked about in your book for us?
Sure. On the photography, the USHMM in DC has about 120,000 digitized images in its collection. And there are hundreds of actual full photo albums that are part of their artifact collection too, that are not fully, that you have to actually go on site to look at. And there are many, many more in Yad Vashem. So I don't have the exact number, but these are significant collections. As I may have mentioned, there were 3.5 million images that were produced of the war. That's estimated by the Germans. So when you have all these various forces, like our Slovakian, right, and the Romanians, and so the various participants taking pictures, and also we have an active Jewish community of photographers, and Jews were a part of the photographic kind of occupation. That was something in an area that they, that shop that I showed you in Mirapol was a Jewish photo shop. People like Marc Chagall, some artists, they started in working in photography, and so this was a realm that Jews worked in as professionals. And so in the Kovno ghetto, for instance, and in the Łódź ghetto, we have really nice photographs that Kaddish and others took surreptitiously often. I mean, Kaddish was taking them through the buttonhole of his coat. Then we had official ghetto photographers who left behind an archive of material. And when you watch the video testimonies at USC, or at the Fortunoff Archive, and you search for photos in those testimonies, in addition to the family photos that survivors present at the end to say, here are our offspring, and this is how we restored our lives after this horror. They often will put up atrocity photos too, and the ones that were in circulation that they got within their communities, maybe when they were doing the Yizkor books, or they just got them in the DP camps. So within the survivor community, there is also a lot of photos that they cling to, as far as, this is what happened to us. Look, this is what happened to us. So it's a rich kind of vein, a rich archive, and it can be a start to a project. It can be the only thing you have from that family or from that community. And they're not mere illustrations. And that the photos themselves, they put things in motion. These photos were used in court cases. They did foment resistance. They do help people, their memory, to retain those memories, and to talk about what happened. So it's a fascinating bit of material visual culture. And so I hope that you'll use it in your research as well. The magnitude of the Holocaust in Ukraine is, it's really understudied and underappreciated. 1 out of 4 victims who died in the Holocaust were residents of what are the borders of Ukraine today. And let's hope they stay those borders. So yeah, this is because it included parts of what was Nazi occupied Poland, because Poland was divvied up. But it's it makes sense, because that's where in the Soviet Union, besides Poland, this is where the czars had concentrated the Jewish community. This is where the Poles, who used to govern that part of Ukraine, the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom, going back to the 15th, 16th century, they invited them to come in and establish these market towns and build up the economy. So, and today, 1% of the population, whereas we had in communities, in the 19th century, there'd be as much as 50% or the majority of the population in some of these villages. So it's a huge change.
Maddie, do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Did the Czech reporters you met at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum understand the significance of the photo they held? Despite previous investigations, nobody excavated the image to such a degree previously. Why is that?
That's great. Thank you, Maddie. I'm so glad the students are asking questions. And I like the last one too. I can still see you on the screen from easily. And now we have Maddie's question. Thank you. Yes, so the journalists, they started a kind of center for the study of totalitarianism, and they were trying to unlock the crimes mostly of the Soviet system when they were going through there, and came across these images in that file, that interrogation file. And I went back to Prague and of course tried to find the additional images and tried to find the negatives, because I wanted to see, what the original picture was, because of the potential for cropping and manipulation, and maybe find more images. So those journalists went back and actually started a program, a kind of research program in Prague on these crimes of the 22. And then after that, the photograph I shared with the Holocaust Museum, and they included it in their exhibit, Some Were Neighbors. And for a time, it was blown up, and some of my information that was part of the caption. And I would go down there and kind of watch people. I would observe visitors and sometimes ask them questions too. I didn't want to interfere with their visit, but I was curious to see how people coming through the museum were responding to that image as well.
Sam, what about you?
So can you talk about the peculiar case of Max Taubner? Does it surprise you that Nazi leaders tried to keep soldiers from photographing their murder of Jews, especially given other public persecutions? And couldn't atrocity images be used in Nazi propaganda to further dehumanize their enemies?
Absolutely. So yeah, Sam, you've done your homework too. And the Nazi, yes, so Nazi propagandists were using horrific images of Jews that they took. They went into, for instance, the Warsaw Ghetto and the Łódź Ghetto. And sometimes they went in not as official propaganda, PK companies, they were called propaganda companies. Sometimes they went in and they engaged in what is called a kind of ghetto tourism. It's a sick ritual where these officials were going in and touring the ghettos and saying, see, I told you they were urban, whatever, you fill in the blank, the derogatory language. Of course, the Germans created those conditions that made them appear that way, but they would take pictures of them. And of course, the Stroop report from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising that has a little boy with his hands raised. There are other images in that album that was presented to Himmler that show Jews and, climbing out of bunkers and sewage holes and all of that. And it's meant to be affirm and say, look, see, this is how they are. And they basically justify their murder and justify their racial ideology and their and the tropes that they kept invoking about the Jews as parasites, as predators, as far as sexual predators, as Bolsheviks, like all these things, these images that they produced and kind of memorialized in their own way. And some of them were slated for a special exhibit for this near extinct race that they were going to actually develop in Prague after the war. So Germans were collecting some of these images for this plan of a kind of post-Holocaust, post-genocidal justification and historical kind of education for their ordinary Germans in a museum form. However, in the case of Taubner, which you mentioned and is in the book, it's the only known instance when Himmler put one of his SS officers on trial in connection with the killing of Jews. But it was not that he was convicted for murdering Jews. The verdict of the court in 1943, and this Max Taubner, Waffen-SS commander, and I'm reading it, he shall not be punished because of the actions against the Jews as such. The Jews have to be exterminated, and none of the Jews that were killed is any great loss. This is the judge's statement. Rather, Taubner was found guilty of excessive barbarism unworthy of a man in uniform because the pictures he took were considered tasteless and shameless, including one of a naked Jewish woman, and he was bragging about them to his wife and friends back in Germany. So it was like the act of taking the photos, as I mentioned, because there was a ban on that. And then the fact that they were considered like too kind of grotesque and too lurid to, he clearly had this kind of sexual fascination with that new Jewish woman, and that was why he was convicted.
Taylor, you want to go next?
So my question is, when you're investigating these genocidal massacres, whether it be through the photographs, live accounts, or even visiting the places like Mariupol, how do you prepare your mind for such a heavy topic?
Are you taking a class right now on the Holocaust?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So you probably have some pretty difficult reading. It is one big trigger warning, this course. I mean, it really, when you sign up for this, that you're going to be engaging in some very difficult material, whether it's written or visual or audio. And maybe you have your own way, and the other students have their own way of kind of mentally, preparing, emotionally kind of preparing for that. Because it is hard. And so much of this material, it generates all kinds of things: outrage, sadness, and shame. Shame as far as what we're capable of doing and what we've done. But those kinds of reactions can be channeled, in the direction of working harder and trying to get to the bottom of it, and dotting your T's and dotting your I's and crossing your T's. Like, it can actually drive you as a scholar and a researcher, because that emotional piece is kind of there as well, as much as we want to try to remain not driven by that as far as how we analyze the material and how we instruct, and teach. But it's there, and it is a driver, and it's because we're human, and we should be upset about these images, but that needs to be kind of channeled towards these other efforts of learning and memorialization and research. And I am so fortunate, because I don't have a direct link to this history. I don't have any family members who were murdered. I can't imagine if I were directly kind of felt that, intimate connection to the history, either through a family member, or just, even an ancestor who made it out, who came from the Pale before the Holocaust, but that kind of connection. I have the benefit of institutions, and I mentioned my colleagues, and we get around the table and we pull up, roll up our sleeves, and we're all trying to kind of work on this together. And that's a real source of solidarity and support. And my Jewish colleagues have been amazing. They're not like overly protective of this history. That's not the case when I try to investigate things with Germans and Ukrainians. Sometimes I get, resistance. And I've, always been kind of welcomed in that community, as far as doing this work, and being supported in that way. So there is an infrastructure out there for this work. And it's something that I also stress in the book. And that's something I'm proud of, that we should all be proud of, because the museum in DC is a huge part of that. And that's something we've invested in as a nation.
Abby. Oops, just unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Can you discuss the way genocide studies and memorialization may have overlooked the significance of the family unit and the importance of excavating family stories?
Yeah, these family stories are an interesting way to approach the past. As I mentioned, we're getting into the tradition in the field of 6 million and reading one name, of trying to bring the individual loss to that level, and also to try to represent the magnitude of this crime, of this event. So what happens in between? You talk about the history of communities, whether it's Warsaw or a small town like Mariupol. And that's helpful as far as reconstructing life before in those lives and restoring that. But when you get down to the family unit, it opens up another dimension. It's part of how we are human is our family experience. Is like a very fundamental core unit of our existence, and the love that's there, and so there are elements of the family unit, especially at this time, because they were very traditional families, that open up other facets of how decisions were made, as I mentioned before, and the importance of these relationships during and also after, and the reunions that occurred after the war or didn't, how the next generation is, confronted with this past, and it's transmitted over generations. And this actually goes to as well for the other families. I mean, the German families, the perpetrators and their descendants, or maybe the Ukrainian policemen and their descendants. That, Emmanuel Levinas has some interesting writings on this about the trajectories of when you have an event like that, of such extreme experience of trauma, and that all the participants in it, are forever changed by it, and it's like it has these various resonances. So, I mean, Lemkin and the other prosecutors at Nuremberg and who influenced Nuremberg and then influenced the UN Convention of 48, it doesn't come up as a category. And it would be difficult to, of course, the Soviets didn't want it the political category or the class category. It became a heated discussion about, in the definition of genocide, how you define the victim group. And who defines it, right? What working definition do you have for the victim group? There's been a lot of scholarship on that, on these different victim groups and how we define them. And one scholar says, all this discussion on the victim group, really the way to understand it is how the perpetrators define them, because that's their target group to in this case, to murder, when it gets to the point of murder. So that's why I brought up the Hitler quote, to try to demonstrate that if in the eyes of the perpetrator, that target, the family, is really important, because it's the source of life, of procreation, right? And it makes sense in the German racial state, because it was a campaign to expand German population and procreative policies and do just the opposite vis-a-vis the Jews, prevent abortions and sterilization, and of course separating families. And you can think about other genocides when this is operative, or how if the family can't retain its function as a unit over long stretches, over generations, what that does overall to that community and their ability to survive.
I'm gonna take the last
Thank you.
question here. Thank you so much for all your time. We're wondering if there's any kind of memorialization or site protection when a mass grave is found in Ukraine, and if or when Russia invades, what do you suspect the impact going to be on the crucial investigative work being done there on the Holocaust?
Yeah, these are really important questions now. I couldn't get this particular site protected because it's part of a military base. The way where it's situated right now, it would have required negotiations. It wasn't. I reported it to the German authorities. They have a mandate. They supported Merkel. A fund was established to support Father Desbois' work. The Germans had been taking care of German graves, war graves of soldiers over the decades. And Father Desbois and other leaders, Jewish leaders in Berlin said, wait a minute, you need to be taking care of these graves too, or at least coordinating them off in some way, or putting a marker up, an educational marker. So I immediately reported this site to the German officials, and they went out. I was shocked. I was there in July 2016, and within 2 or 3 weeks, they were there on the scene, because I gave them the exact coordinates, and we had contacted the rabbi too, the chief rabbi in Strasbourg. And they determined that they couldn't, it was so gnarly in there, and the roots and the trees and forest, that they couldn't technically get the ground penetrating radar to work to figure out like the parameters of the space to try to actually. And as I said, it had been so disrupted. I mean, there were vandals who went in there and were stealing things, and it's terrible what happened to that grave. So unfortunately, in that case, it's not marked. But you're absolutely right. We have found thousands of these sites since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Germans said, you know, the list is so long and we can't do it all. We can't protect all of them. And now with this potential, this possible invasion, it's just going to set everything off. Not to mention just if there's actual warfare, there'll be more destruction of the landscape, you know, and so that will add another complicating layer. And my Ukrainian colleagues have been amazing over the decades. As I mentioned, very hospitable, very supportive, organizing programs, training teachers, being open in their archives, allowing us to go in and digitize their materials and help them organize them and preserve them. Yeah, it's been really troubling to see what's happening now, because unlike some other neighboring countries, Ukraine has been really earnestly building this memorial in Babi Yar, embracing Western approaches, bringing Western scholars and setting up journals, translating my book, translating other people's work, just, you know, open to learning more and wanting to do more, and involving the Jewish community as well. So we have the Jewish president of Ukraine right now, Zelensky. I mean, these are things that are just not happening in Poland and Ukraine, just the opposite. And and historically, you know, as important, you know, for Holocaust history and certainly for Jewish history. I mean, very important. Most Americans who say, Jewish Americans who say, oh, my family's from Russia, they're from Ukraine, like almost 99% of the time.
Thank you so much for your decades of work on these important historical matters, and for this extra 60 minutes that you've given to Centenary College. We really appreciate it. There are so many interesting comments in the chat and questions too. And those of you who pose questions, I'm going to make sure, although you won't be able to hear the answer live, that Dr. Lower does get them, that she knows that these are things that you were interested in. And I also want to let you know that this will be on Centenary's YouTube channel. So the webinar was recorded. And I want to let the students have their passport points. So I'm going to go ahead and post the QR code for that too. And hopefully you can see it. It's a safe QR code. And I'll scroll down. I don't know if you can fit it all on the screen. I'm gonna try to get that to work for you all, so that you can travel, do educational travel. Maybe Ukraine is a place that you'll look into going to. And thank you again. We just really appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah, somebody asked about the Jewish poet. It's Abraham. I put it in the chat, but it didn't go to the full audience. Abraham Sutzkever, Sutzkever. And there's a new book that came out about him that also got a National Jewish Book Award for translation. Finally, his memoirs and his diaries are in English, and his poetry is astounding. And he was the first to speak at Nuremberg on behalf of the Jews, and his diary of that experience of coming out and bearing witness. Yeah, I highly recommend that book. So it's a good source.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and everybody stay safe and take care, and thank you for being here.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Dr. Nicoletti.
Bye. Thank you.